Dad's hidden affair came out during Christmas morning. The Gift Nobody Wanted, a Christmas morning thriller. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains over Maple Ridge, Connecticut, blanketing the colonial-style homes in a deceptive purity. At 6:47 a.m. on December 25th, while the rest of Elm Street slept beneath their festive lights and inflatable Santas, 17-year-old Jake Brennan stood in his father's home office with a stolen key in one hand and a truth in the other that would burn their family to the ground. He hadn't meant to find it. That was the lie he'd tell himself later, the one that would keep him company through sleepless nights and therapy sessions and the long, empty years of estrangement. But the truth, the real truth, the one that pulsed behind his eyes like a migraine, was that Jake had been looking for something for months. A receipt, a text message, the faint ghost of perfume on his father's collar that smelled nothing like his mother's vanilla lotion. The leather-bound journal had been hidden behind a false panel in the mahogany desk, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of old money and darker secrets. Jake's fingers had trembled when he found the release mechanism, some part of him already knowing, already mourning the father he'd thought he knew. December 3rd, the first entry read, "She wore red today. I can't breathe when she walks into the room." Jake read the name. Then he read it again. And in the frozen silence of that Christmas morning, while carols played softly from the kitchen stereo and his mother hummed along as she prepared the turkey, Jake Brennan felt his childhood die. 3 hours earlier, the Brennan household had been a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. "Jake, honey, come help your sister with the lights," Margaret Brennan called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular warmth that only appeared during the holidays. She stood at the granite island, flour dusting her cheek where she'd absently brushed away a stray hair, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she consulted the recipe card her own mother had written in 1968. The house on 442 Elm Street was a masterpiece of Christmas excess. Margaret had spent 3 weekends dragging boxes from the attic, transforming their 4-bedroom colonial into what the Neighborhood Association newsletter had called the most spirited display on the block. The tree, real, of course, hand-selected from O'Malley's tree farm in Vermont, touched the 12-foot ceiling in the great room, its branches heavy with ornaments collected over 23 years of marriage. Each one told a story. The ceramic angel from their honeymoon in Cape Cod, the tiny cowboy boot from their trip to Austin, the handprint reindeer Jake had made in kindergarten that Margaret refused to retire despite its cracked antler. "Mom, the lights are fine," Jake muttered, but he wandered in anyway, drawn by the gravitational pull of his mother's happiness. At 6'2", with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, Jake had the kind of awkwardness that came with recent growth spurts, always bumping into door frames, always surprised by his own reflection. "Nonsense! The bottom strand is out, and your father will notice." Margaret smiled, but something flickered behind her eyes, a shadow that had become familiar over the past year. "He notices everything." "Does he?" Jake wanted to ask. Does he notice you crying in the laundry room at 2 a.m.? Does he notice that you stopped wearing the perfume he bought you? Does he notice that his son can smell another woman's shampoo on his skin? But Jake said nothing. He never did. In the Brennan family, silence was the currency of survival, and Jake had become wealthy beyond measure. Richard Brennan entered through the mudroom at 7:15 a.m., stamping snow from his LL Bean boots, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. At 49, he was the kind of man who aged well, silver threading his temples like distinguished wiring, shoulders still broad from his college rowing days at Yale. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had built something from nothing, who had transformed a small insurance brokerage in Hartford into a regional empire with offices in Boston and Philadelphia. "Merry Christmas, family," he boomed, setting down a bag from Donovan's bakery. "Got the cinnamon rolls, the real ones, not that grocery store garbage." Margaret lit up like a child, rushing to kiss him, and Jake watched the performance with the detachment of a theater critic. The embrace lasted exactly 3 seconds. He'd timed it. The kiss landed on the corner of Margaret's mouth, not her lips. Richard's left hand stayed in his coat pocket, where Jake knew he kept his phone. "Jake, help your father with his coat," Margaret instructed, already reaching for the bakery bag. I've got it. Richard waved him off, hanging the Burberry trench on the antique coat rack himself, the same rack where, 3 weeks ago, Jake had found a scarf that didn't belong to anyone in their family. Cashmere, burnt orange, the color of autumn leaves and warning signs. "So," Richard said, rubbing his hands together, "who's ready for presents?" The tradition was immutable, carved in stone like the 10 Commandments. Christmas morning began with cinnamon rolls and coffee, followed by the reading of Luke 2:1-20, Margaret's requirement despite their sporadic church attendance. And then, the main event, gift opening in the great room, each person taking turns, each gift documented by Richard's Canon camera for the annual photo album. Jake's sister, Emily, burst into the room at 7:30, her 14-year-old energy irrepressible despite the early hour. She wore flannel pajamas patterned with penguins, her blonde hair, Margaret's hair, tangled in a messy bun. "Did Santa come? Did he come?" she shrieked, though she'd stopped believing at 9 and only maintained the fiction for their mother's sake. "Emily, you're 15 in March," Jake said, but he was smiling despite himself. His sister had that effect on him, a reminder that innocence still existed in the world, even if his own had curdled. 14 3/4, thank you very much. And Santa is real if you believe hard enough." She stuck out her tongue, then gasped at the sight of the presents beneath the tree. "Mom, did you see how many there are?" Margaret appeared with a tray of cinnamon rolls, her smile fixed in place like a Renaissance mask. "Your father went a bit overboard this year. Only the best for my girls," Richard said, winking at Emily. "And my boy, of course. Got you something special, Jake. Something that says, 'You're a man now.'" Jake felt his stomach clench. The words should have warmed him. 6 months ago, they would have. but now they landed like accusations, each syllable heavy with the weight of his father's deception. "Let's do this," Jake said quietly. The first gifts were harmless, the usual choreography of upper middle class Christmas. Margaret received a KitchenAid mixer in pistachio green. "For all that baking you do, honey." Emily got the latest iPhone. "Only because your grades were stellar this semester." And Richard unwrapped a Rolex from Margaret that Jake knew had required her to drain her inherited savings account. Then it was Jake's turn. Richard handed him a box wrapped in silver paper, heavy and substantial. "This one's from me. Open it last, after your mother's." Jake set it aside, reaching instead for Margaret's gift, a leather jacket from Wilson's that he'd mentioned wanting in September, back when he'd still talked to his mother about things that mattered. She'd remembered. Of course she had. Margaret Brennan forgot nothing except her own worth. "Thanks, Mom. It's perfect." She beamed, and Jake felt something crack inside his chest. How much did she know? Anything? Nothing? The possibilities were equally devastating. Richard cleared his throat, a sound like gravel in a blender. "My turn. Go on, Jake. Open it." The box was heavier than it looked. Jake peeled back the paper with mechanical precision, revealing a wooden case with brass fittings. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a Smith & Wesson Model 686 revolver, its stainless steel gleaming under the Christmas lights. "A man's first gun," Richard announced, his voice swelling with pride. "For when you go to Penn State next fall, campus safety, you know, and we can go to the range together like we used to." The room tilted. Jake stared at the weapon, at its beautiful, terrible potential, and thought of the journal hidden in his hoodie pocket. He thought of the entry from November 14th. "She wants me to leave Margaret. She says we could be happy in Charleston, start fresh. I'm considering it." Considering it. As if 23 years of marriage, 2 children, a life built brick by brick in this Connecticut town was a lease agreement he could simply choose not to renew. "Jake, say something, son." Richard's smile faltered, the first crack in his armor. Jake looked up, met his father's eyes, those same gray eyes he'd inherited, now clouded with something that might have been concern or might have been fear. And in that moment, standing in the great room of 442 Elm Street with a revolver in his lap and betrayal in his heart, Jake Brennan made a choice. He reached into his pocket. The journal hit the hardwood floor with a sound like a gunshot. The room froze. Margaret's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Emily's new phone slipped from her fingers, forgotten. Outside, a dog barked somewhere on Elm Street, and the snow continued its silent descent, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding beneath it. "What?" Richard began, but his voice cracked. He knew. Jake could see the knowledge bloom across his father's face like a bruise, purple and spreading. "Pick it up," Jake said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and calm. "Read the entry from December 3rd, the one where you can't breathe because she walks into the room. Read it, Dad. Read it to Mom." Margaret set down her coffee. Her hands were steady, Jake noticed, steadier than they'd been in months. "Jake, what is this?" Ask him. Jake pointed at his father with a trembling finger. Ask Richard Brennan, pillar of the Hartford business community, deacon of St. Mark's Episcopal. Ask him who she is. Ask him about the apartment in New Haven. Ask him about the trips to Charleston that weren't really business. Ask him, stop. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. He hadn't moved from his chair, hadn't reached for the journal. His face had gone the color of old ash. Jake, please, not like this. Not like this? Jake laughed, and the sound was ugly, broken. How then, Dad? Over dinner? In a therapy session? Should I have scheduled it between your golf game and your board meeting? Emily was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. What's happening? Someone tell me what's happening. Margaret stood, walked to the journal with the careful steps of a woman navigating a minefield. She picked it up, opened it, read. The silence stretched into infinity, each second a year, each year a lifetime of accumulated grief. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. Charleston, she said softly, you hate the heat. You always said you'd never live south of the Mason-Dixon. Richard finally moved, rising from his chair with the slow inevitability of a condemned man. Maggie, I can explain. Can you? She closed the journal, held it against her chest like a shield. Can you explain the hotel charges I found in March? The business dinners that lasted until 3 a.m.? The way you stopped touching me 2 years ago and I told myself it was stress, it was the business, it was anything but this. Maggie, don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't you dare Maggie me. Not after this. Not after you made our son into your detective. Jake flinched. He hadn't considered that angle. The way his sleuthing would implicate him in the destruction. He'd thought he was protecting her. He'd thought he was being strong. I didn't, he started. But Margaret turned to him, and her expression stopped his breath. You knew, she said. It wasn't an accusation, merely a statement of fact. How long? 6 months. I found a text message last June. I didn't want to believe it. I thought if I found proof, real proof, then maybe. He trailed off, the inadequacy of his reasoning stark in the Christmas morning light. Then maybe what? You could fix it? You could save us? Margaret laughed, a hollow sound. Oh, Jake, my sweet, foolish boy, you can't save people who don't want to be saved. Richard had retreated to the window, his back to the room, his reflection ghostly against the falling snow. Her name is Diana, he said to the glass. She's a consultant. We met in Boston. It wasn't supposed to. He stopped, shook his head. That's the lie, isn't it? It was always supposed to happen. I wanted it to happen. The confession landed like a physical blow. Jake watched his mother's face crumple, watched her rebuild herself in real time, brick by brick, until she stood before them as someone new, harder, sharper, but somehow more real than the woman who'd baked cinnamon rolls that morning. Get out, she said. Richard turned. Maggie, it's Christmas. The roads. I don't care if there's a blizzard. I don't care if you freeze to death on the driveway. Get out of my house. Your house? Richard's shock transformed into something uglier, defensive. I paid for this house. I paid for everything. Your car, your clothes, Emily's school, Jake's future. You want to talk about contributions? Let's talk about contributions. Fine. Margaret walked to the kitchen, returned with her purse. She withdrew a checkbook. An ancient habit. Richard had always teased her about it and scribbled furiously. 50,000 from my father's estate. The down payment on this house. You always said it was a gift, but let's call it what it was. An investment in a lie. She ripped out the check, let it flutter to the floor between them. Consider your investment returned. With interest. Richard stared at the check, at his wife, at the ruins of his life. For a moment, Jake saw something flicker across his face. Regret, perhaps, or merely the calculation of losses. Then he bent, retrieved the check, folded it carefully into his wallet. I'll send for my things, he said. Don't bother. I'll have them delivered. To Charleston, was it? Or the apartment in New Haven? I'm sure Diana will appreciate the gesture. Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at Jake, really looked at him, and for a heartbeat, Jake saw his father, the real one, the man who'd taught him to ride a bike and throw a curveball and shake hands like you meant it. Then the mask slid back into place, and Richard Brennan was merely a stranger in a Burberry coat, gathering his keys and his phone and his carefully constructed excuses. "Merry Christmas," he said, and walked out the door. The silence that followed was biblical in its scope, a void where a family had once existed. Emily had curled into the corner of the sofa, her knees drawn to her chest, her new phone crushed against her palm. Margaret stood at the window, watching her husband's BMW disappear into the snow until the taillights were merely memory. Jake picked up the revolver, felt its weight, its terrible potential. He thought of the journal entries he hadn't shared, the ones about Diana's laugh, her cooking, the way she understood him in ways Margaret never could. He thought of his father's hands, those same hands that had thrown baseballs and built tree houses and signed contracts worth millions, now touching another woman in another city while his family slept unaware. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Margaret turned. Her face was wet now, the tears finally coming, but her voice was steady. "For what? Telling the truth? For not telling you sooner? For thinking I could handle it alone? For—" He stopped, the words inadequate, the guilt overwhelming. "You were trying to protect me." Margaret crossed the room, took the gun from his hands, set it on the coffee table with deliberate care. "That's what Brennans do, isn't it? We protect each other with secrets. We love each other in the dark." She sat beside Emily, gathered her daughter into her arms, and Jake watched them cling to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. He thought of all the Christmases to come, the first ones without Richard, the awkward negotiations of custody and holidays, the years of therapy and resentment and slow, painful healing. He thought of the man he'd been this morning, naive and angry and desperate for justice, and he mourned that boy as surely as he mourned his father. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice muffled against Margaret's shoulder. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at the Christmas tree with its decades of memories, its ornaments telling stories that would never be quite the same. "We eat the cinnamon rolls," she said finally. "They're getting cold. And then we figure it out, one day at a time, together." Jake nodded, though his throat was too tight for words. He walked to the kitchen, retrieved the tray of pastries his mother had spent hours preparing, brought them back to the great room where his family sat in the wreckage of their former lives. The cinnamon rolls were still warm, sweet with brown sugar and pecans, and they ate them in silence that slowly, imperceptibly shifted from mourning to something else, something like hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Maple Ridge, Connecticut, covering the tracks of a BMW heading south, erasing the footprints of a man who had chosen escape over endurance. Inside 442 Elm Street, three people sat among the ruins of Christmas, surrounded by gifts that suddenly seemed trivial, and began the impossible work of building something new from the ashes. Jake thought of the journal, still lying on the floor where his mother had dropped it. He thought of the last entry, dated December 24th, Christmas Eve. "Tomorrow I'll tell them. Tomorrow I'll be free." His father had been right about one thing, at least. Tomorrow had brought freedom, just not the kind anyone had wanted. Margaret reached across the sofa, took Jake's hand in hers. Her fingers were cold, trembling, but her grip was fierce. "We're going to be okay," she said, and for the first time that morning, Jake almost believed her. The Christmas lights flickered on the tree, casting colored shadows across the room, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to ring. Not the end, Jake realized. Not yet. Just a different kind of beginning. Closing note. Hey there, story lovers. Thank you for riding out this emotional Christmas morning with me. If this tale of secrets, betrayal, and the fragile strength of family struck a chord, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next drop. We've got thrillers, dramas, and heart-stoppers dropping every week, straight from the twisted streets of American suburbia to your screen. Good luck out there. Keep your eyes open, your hearts guarded, and remember, the most dangerous secrets are always the ones hiding in plain sight. Stay on this channel. The next story might just save your life.